Hello to everyone. Welcome to our today's webinar, which is about climate risks. My name is Maxim Shilov. I'm the head of Food and Agriculture practice in GrECo Group, a risk and insurance specialist operating in 17 countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Okay, thank you for visiting our webinar. I will moderate this event today. Let me introduce today our speakers, our guests. Also today participate special guest, who is Georg Winter, our CEO of GrECo Holding. Hello, Georg. Nice to meet you. Nice to see you.
Hello, Maxim. Hello, everybody.
Let me also introduce our speakers. Juan Pham, who is the head of industry adaptation at AXA Climate. Hi, Juan. Nice to see you. Juan will introduce today European regulation requirements related to physical climate risks and climate adaptation, as well as how to adapt industrial assets in food and agriculture to climate change. Our second speaker is Lucile Dauger. Hello, Lucile.
Hi. Hello, thank you, Maxim.
Lucile is Agri-Product Manager at AXA Climate. Lucile will tell us today how companies in food and agriculture can better be prepared for ongoing and future climate changes. Very interesting topic as well. And the last speaker will be me. I will outline main ways to transfer the weather risks, agricultural and parametric insurance in particular, for the whole food supply chain, in order to get financial recovery, financial compensation in the event of weather catastrophic event. Okay, dear participants, during the presentation, please ask questions on the chat, and our speakers will answer after their presentation. So we will have 5 minutes Q&A session. I would like also to inform you that the webinar will be recorded. Participants, except speakers, are not visible and muted. So now I give the first word to Juan Pham. And also today you can ask, of course, questions to our CEO, Georg Winter, so Georg also can answer. Because actually, environmental topic is one of key pillars of GrECo strategy. We also encourage you to visit AXA Climate School to get more about to know more about climate change and impact of climate change in the world. Okay, let's start. So Juan, the floor is yours.
Okay, I just removed the camera then for my bandwidth and for the webinar, so that you can hear me better. So I would like to thank Georg for the strategic partnership that we have set with GrECo for the past month. We have done several, let's say, work together, and we are very pleased to, let's say, fostering and strengthening this partnership together with you in Central Eastern Europe. I will be very fast in the slide, let's say, that we are going to show, because we have a lot of topics to share with you. I rely on you, Maxim, to tell us if we are maybe sometimes deep diving too much and making the timekeeping job, which is not an easy job. So feel free to interrupt us if you think that we are falling behind schedule. But we have a lot of very passionate people, let's say, topics to share with you. First, introduction to who we are at AXA Climate and the emergency to act, then a focus on European regulations, and then we'll deep dive on two specific topics, one led by Lucile on agriculture and supply chain connection with and the consequences from climate change on this specific topic, and then the specific topic of adapting industrial assets as well to climate change. So let's start with AXA Climate. We are quite a young company, but growing very fast with let's say, the challenges raised by climate change. We were less than 50 3 years ago, and now we're reaching a headcount of 180 members. Nearly 1/3 of our team members are scientists, and that makes a huge difference versus other consulting firms because we rely all our business practices on science and data. These two pillars of our business proposal, science and data, are the foundations of the parametric insurance business that you can see here on the left, and which laid the ground for our company back in 2019. Now, 3 years ago, we started the consulting business because we have realized that there was very high value from this climate data coming from parametric insurance, and we're successfully launched this consulting practice 3 years ago, and now getting, let's say, more opportunities to help corporate customers to transition on their climate transition challenges. Then also last topic that raised by Maxime is the climate score, for which we will share in the chat later today with all participants. We have a special gift to access the climate score on an individual basis. This is free of charge, and that will give you more, let's say, awareness on this very important topic for our societies. I skipped the financing part for the sake of time. What is climate change about? It is, when we're talking about climate change, it's about the double materiality of climate. On one hand, the company will impact the climate with, as you know, GHG emissions, carbon emissions, and that's what we call decarbonization and transition risk. Today, we'll focus on the other side of the impact from climate change on the company, and this is what we call climate adaptation and physical climate risk. Do you think that I'm not talking too fast, Maxime? It's okay?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, so this is what we do at AXA Climate, and that's the content of the partnership that we have proposed to GrECo and in your Central and Eastern Europe areas. And today we can talk a lot about the left part, but we'll today focus more on this physical climate risk topic, which is already a very challenging one for most of corporate customers. This is a highlight of our customer portfolio as of today. As you can see, there's a mix of industrial companies, but also agri-food companies that you're very well aware of for some of them, some French, from European, and some other global companies as well. So why do we need to act today? In fact, people thought that climate change impact were in very far away countries like Asia, Americas. What is new is that extreme climate events now take place in the vicinity of Europe, here on the territory of European countries. So this is why it is very important to act, because in fact climate change already started quite a long time ago, but it is now very visible as well in Europe. That's why European regulators have adopted a few years ago new regulations. That's what we call a European taxonomy, and especially CSRD, on which we will focus on the next 5 slides. Previously to that, maybe some of you, if we have a corporate customer here in this webinar, has already started to investigate volunteer framework such as TCFD, which were, let's say, started to be implemented by several companies for the past even 8 years. So this is not something new, but the trend is that European regulation will make this mandatory for many companies, and we'll deep dive on that today. Also, another topic is that there are more and more rating agencies on CSR or ESG topics, which are much more, let's say, rigorous and demanding on climate disclosure. And this is something that you should not overlook if your company is not fluent in climate regulations yet. Let's focus on the next 5 slides, and we'll just make a pause of 5 minutes on Q&A, as Maxime said. Let's focus now on CSRD. CSRD is a very important directive. This is Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and this is not really new because there was already what we called NFRD before, which were implemented in Europe, especially for financial institutions. What is new is that there will be requests to have audited data, which means that you cannot do only qualitative assessment. You'll have to be more granular and to have more quantitative data to share in the very near future. And this is part of a more global strategy from European regulators, what we call the European Green Deal and the Sustainable Finance Agenda. To be very transparent, there's some ongoing discussion at the European Parliament today, some lobbying pressure to, let's say, postpone part of this climate disclosure. But for sure, what we think at AXA Climate from our knowledge of this topic is that climate disclosure will stay as something very will not be postponed, to put it simply. So what is new is that they will include value chain. That's why Lucile will focus on also the supply chain related to food and agriculture. There are new topics which are addressed, which we will not address today, like biodiversity and natural ecosystem. And they ask you to look at the double materiality. So for climate, it is both attenuation and adaptation. The other thing is that it will impact a lot of companies. As you can see, before we had like 12,000 companies which were impacted by NFRD, yes. And with CSRD, there are many more companies that will be impacted with those criteria which are shown here on the right. Maxime, I think that we agree that we'll be able to share the slides to the participants. So you don't need to take the screenshots or to take notes of all the details. We'll be pleased to share that with you. Implementation program is being discussed, as I said, at the European Parliament. But for listed companies, for sure, there will be a lot of pressure on climate disclosure starting in 2025. And in fact, starting 2025, based on 2024 financial accounts. So our feedback is that Western European countries, Western European-based companies for whom we are working today are already preparing this agenda as of today in 2023. So we have a lot of requests doing that. This is an overview of what CSRD is requesting. There's a strong focus on climate change. There are many more environmental topics which are to be disclosed, but also a very important section related to social topics. Something which is not new, which is ethic and business conduct, which is about corruption as well in terms of governance for a company. I will not deep dive on that. It is just to show you to the participants of this webinar that there's a lot of available documentation made available by the European Union, which are very comprehensive. Our job at AXA Climate is to make things simple for our customers and to help them to identify the material challenges and material topics so that they can be compliant in the disclosure that they have to prepare in the coming months, if not a very couple of years. So this is it for the regulations. I don't know if you have seen any questions in the chat, Maxime, because I can see the chat on my side. So I just
so far we don't have any questions.
So the last message is the European regulation is very demanding. Do not hesitate to prepare that in advance. to have, let's say, what we call a first materiality assessment before deep diving on the disclosure effort. And our job will be to help you to go through and prioritize the topics to disclose. But there are a lot of topics, more than 100 indicators, just to say it very simply. Now, jumping on the next section of our presentation, where does the need of adaptation come from? In fact, as of today, this is the 2020, let's say, baseline climate conditions. Compared to pre-industrial levels, extreme temperature has already have been risen with higher frequency already, with impact on rainfall, which are more frequent as well, and especially extreme rainfall and drought, where are also more frequent than 1 century ago. Now, this is the target that we try to limit the whole for the whole planet with the 2-degree Paris Agreement, and even limiting the impact of climate change to 2 degrees will still worsen climate condition in a quite dramatic way. We are not talking about the 4-degree here. Well, yes, we are talking about the 4-degree scenario, which is a pessimistic scenario, but which is very plausible, which is very highly, which is still likely to occur if the governments and the corporate companies have not let's say, reduce their GHG emissions enough in the coming decades. So this is what we will be facing, a very extreme impact from different climate indicators, and therefore those will impact in agricultural yields, human health, industrial assets, etc. Of course, the operations here for the textile industry will impact both human employees, but also the operations. Upstream, there will be availability of natural resources, which will threaten the supply of this textile industry, and clients will also be impacted on their side with change of customer patterns, or also on the distribution channel. So therefore, that's why I will leave the floor now to Lucile, who will talk with you about the consequences of climate change on food and agriculture supply chain. Leave you the floor, Lucile.
Thank you, Juan, for your presentation. Probably some questions appeared from participants. We have time to answer. Okay. As I understand correctly, Juan, that large companies, which means it should be above 250 employees or turnover above 50 million, and or assets above 20 million, should start disclosing in their financial reports climatic topics from the 1st of January 2025, correct? Just to understand the general message that actually they are obliged to do it, or it's expected that they are obliged.
It's expected. There's a progressive way. In fact, they have to start, because in fact they will not have to implement the full scope here. I focus on ESRS E1, which is the European Sustainability Reporting, which are let's say the reporting standard connected to CSRD. ESRS E1 related to climate change is the first brick, which is mandatory. Yes, Gerd, you have a question or comment?
Thank you, Juan. I just want to let you know that I think the participants cannot unmute themselves. So I would suggest for those who cannot unmute, please ask your questions via the chat, because this should work.
Correct. You're right to mention that, of course.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
But it's for me, from just one comment from my side. Thank you very much. I mean, we had already our discussions. I see it very, very interesting that we are here very much in line with the approach that you and we have. You know, on the one hand side, the focus on the physical climate risks, but also what I see, what is very important also to not forget about the, as we call it, the secondary risks, the transition risks of adaptation, because we see a lot of clients now really already starting adapting the change, changing their business model, changing their processes, and this is now another, not only physical, but another world or another risk landscape for our clients.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. You're right, and we can. You're right to say that. In fact, the two topics, transition risk and physical risk, are quite. Let's say. There are connections between the two topics, and that's why more and more for the past 6 months we are at AXA Climate conducting missions where we cover the two scope of work because they are complementary, because the impact of the climate change, the physical risk, can change and induce some significant strategic, let's say, can change the strategic roadmap of a company, especially, and that will be also a connection to Lucile, good transition, especially if they're in the agri and food business. Obviously, there are the frontline companies who are already impacted by climate change for sure. So let's move on then, Lucile.
Okay, thank you, Georg, for your comments. Thank you, Juan, for your response. So I give floor to Lucile.
Yes, thank you very much, Maxime, and thank you, Juan, for this presentation. So I'm Lucile, I'm an agronomist, and I'm here to tell you why it would be urgent and necessary to quantify the impact of climate change on the agribusiness field, and why it's necessary to build transition and adaptation plans that are sustainable. So a bit of why, and then a bit of how we are able to do this. Why is, just as Juan said a bit before, it's because it's happening right now. Climate change already tackle agribusiness everywhere in the world, and also already in Europe, with some recent climatic event that you can have in memory also. We're talking about already a warming of 1.1 degrees since the last century, that leading to up to 4 times more heat waves frequency and intensity by 2030, which is in 7 years. So it's actually tomorrow for a farmer. And for according to studies that will lead, especially in north of France, on vegetables and peas, could lead to dramatic losses in terms of yield, up to a third of the production on the worst case scenario. So the why is pretty clear and obvious, but the how we can work on the adaptation is a bit technical on the agri. That's we're gonna deep dive together today. So next slide, please. So each agri value chain needs to be understood a bit in detail to be sure that the adaptation, to be sure that we quantify the risk properly, so we can build adaptation plan properly. When we talk about a crop, for instance, it's easy to understand that each step of development will not have the same sensitivity to climate. For instance, here, orange, the blooming, the flowering phase that's happened, for instance, in Spain in April and June, will be extremely sensitive to wind or to heavy rain, while a bit before, during the vegetative period in winter, March, April, before the bud bursts, it's more resilient, more solid to such event. So at AXA Climate, what we do is we project for each what we call phenological stage, or just the stage of one crop, we project all the sensitivity of these stages to our climatic scenario to be sure that we quantify the risk properly. So when we're talking about the scenarios, that's the next slide, please. I saw a comment, someone doesn't see the slide. Already. I hope it's good now. So when we talk about climatic scenario, what we do is we project 2 climate scenario according to the IPCC projection, what we call the pessimistic scenario that you can see in red on the graph here, which leads to the mid-century warming of 1.9 to 3 degrees. and we compare it to what we call the optimistic scenario, or also called technically called the SSP 2.4.5, which is what would happen in terms of emission if we follow the Paris Agreement of 2020. So at AXA Climate, what we do is we project the IPCC climate scenario according to these two pathways, the worst case, the base case, let's say, to see what's possible in terms of landing in climate, to see where are they possible. So next slide, please. Thank you very much. Yes, yeah? It's good now. Okay. Thank you very much. So to be able to build together with Agri-Product a client, for instance, some relevant adaptation solution that will for sure de-risk the supply chain. We do, and that's what I'm going to present you today, a 3-step methodology to be sure to identify the crop and location that are most at risk in the supply chain. Step 1 is to assess the climate risk and opportunity across the activities. So where is the climate change more likely to change, with what intensity, and so what crop will be more at risk. Step 2 is on those locations where we've identified more evolution of the climates and more potential impacts, we'll quantify the specific impact, so quantify the impact of one heat wave of corn, for instance, and so on. And once we've identified, okay, that's where it's going to hit the most in this location. So for sure, you're going to need to work on an adaptation plan for those risks in this location on this crop. We're able to build relevant adaptation plan and also to draw a return of investments about those adaptation plan compared to the potential yield loss that you would have without the plan compared to the potential cost of the solution. So for the first part of the climate risk, this next slide, please. I think it's a bit slow to turn on the okay, so here a bit of illustration. So I'll take an example of corn production in, let's say, a region of France, where we've done this 3 steps of quantifying the climate change, quantifying the impacts, and designing where the adaptation solution should be built to tackle this evolution. So first is the climate. For corn, for instance, one critical period would be around the harvest, July, August, because the corns are on the field and, for instance, more sensitive to heat. If you leave them too much, eventually the grain will lose its quality and so on. So it was important for a corn producer to know how the heat, and especially the peak of heat, so the maximal temperature, will happen in July and August. And on the region of production, you understand that it's super important, and that's why we work with a lot of scientific in our teams to have a really local shade of analysis on the in one region. We have several difference up to 2.8 degrees, for instance, which is in this region more than, I don't know, 50 kilometers. But those 2 degrees difference in the peak of temperature will have a huge impact on the yield. So the local grid of analysis is key to be able to project the impact on the climate. So we compare historical climate projection 2030 short-term actions and 2050 more long-term actions to be project. So now we start with, okay, in my climate, according to this first climate analysis that you have just a glimpse here on corn, for instance, I do understand that the north region that you see on the map could be less at risk than the south region, because eventually the corn do tolerate temperature up to 35 degrees. So the 36 is too much, 33 should be okay. So once we've got those learning, we can deep dive and look at what are the specific indicators for corn and how they behave in the future. So that would be the next slide, please. So for each crop, as I present you with the phenological stage and the specificity of each stage, we've built specific indicators. No, okay, at the harvest, for instance, corn tolerates 35 degrees for 2 days. At bud burst, it could be something else. So all those indicators, we project them for each region to see what will contribute in the scoring, risk scoring the most, and in which location those scores will be the highest. So that's one project for the quantification of the risk that we build for each pedoclimatic area. So taking into consideration also the local specificities of the soil, of the altitude, for instance, to spot what's risk, what indicators will appear the most on our risk. Evolution score by assets on below allow us also to identify, for instance, when one farmer who does corn and then wheat and then soy, for instance, what culture will be more at risk and where he should target these efforts. So here, for instance, after this risk quantification, just a bit before, we know that the hot days at the mixed maximal temperature will contribute to 26% to the risk. The cumulative precipitation at one certain period to another part of the risk, and the frost day will compare to the risk. Of course, we always compare to the baseline situation to see to compare with historical risks. For instance, usually the frost day could remain, but we're talking about climate warming. The frost risk still exists, but will be reduced. So once starting now, we know that my corn in my region will suffer from very hot day during the summer just before the harvest, and a bit then second risk could be the extreme rain events during the bud burst, for instance. So we've identified the highest climate risk for my crop, and with our modeling, we're able to project the possible loss of yield. We can do it large scale for all risk, but we're also able to project them really precisely. So we know that for a farmer in this region, it will be key because it would lead to the most yield loss to work on the hot weather during summer. Second step would be, okay, what can I do to adapt to this hot weather during the summer? Could I work on different crops and varieties? Could I try to sow earlier and avoid the extreme heat wave of late July, for instance, if I'm able to sow before? Could I try to innovate in cultural practices, or eventually irrigate more, or invest in more efficient irrigation systems so that the corn will suffer less from the heat? Or is it too expensive or too hard to change the system, and I shall explore new areas, for instance, the one on the south, that on the north of the region that I've presented you a couple slides before, that seems to suffer less from the heat wave. So we draw and we deep dive into a panel of potential adaptation measures that could be implemented to this region. What could be the cost of implementation, the cost of implementing a new culture, the cost of changing varieties, the feasibility of changing sowing, for instance. One quick example is on the sowing. I could sow earlier if the conditions are okay on before, and I can project the efficiency of the solution. For instance, my crop varieties, I told you that my corn tolerate 35 degrees. What would happen if I invest in a varieties that tolerate 38 degrees? Will that be still at risk of heat, or will this frequency of risk will drop? So here we can have an idea, a precise idea on the return of investment of the change system. So here you have those 3 steps: from climate to quantify the risk, to quantify the efficiency of a solution, adaptation solution at a farm level or pedoclimatic level. So we're able to draw tomorrow and more resilient farming system. That's a bit of the idea of the necessity and how we can deep dive on the climate. Another example, another story that I wanted to tell you about today would be so not corn in France, but this time we're in India and we're looking at grape production, table grape production. India is one big producer of grapes, and we had this situation when some farmers came to us to say, okay, we are suffering. So if you remember, a couple years ago, last year actually, there was a major heat wave in India, in the spring region. They were fearing this situation would happen again. So we had this project to project if the heat issue would be as terrible as they fear in the future. So we've done what I've just presented, the methodology that I've presented you with the climate projection, vulnerability assessment, and estimation of the financial impacts on yield and quality to project adaptation recommendation. And here, what was super interesting is that the issue was not necessarily the heat as they would have feared, because it would happen at a moment where the grape is not at risk. Actually, it's not, the fruit is not on the trees, so it's not sensitive at this moment. So even if heat waves would happen in the future, yes, but not at a risky moment. But because of the monsoon and the rainfall evolution, the fruits would be at risk at the later in the year. Basically, in India, the monsoon season will be a bit later and more intense, so more short and more basically more intense, and that would have huge impacts on the grapes before the harvest. It could lead to berry cracking, flooded soil, for instance, so operational risk, disease such as mildew, for instance, that could lead to potential yield. So in this situation, the risk was not where the farmers would fear would be, but somewhere else, but was still able to build a adaptation solution to tackle this risk. So two different regions to really heard you on the necessity to understand why it's important to quantify the climate risk and how we can build solution to build more resilient agri supply chains in the future. I hope I was not too quick, but I'm happy to answer any question if you have an interest in other example, for instance.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucile, for your presentation. It really looks very interesting and very useful. So let me have a look if we have any questions on the chat. By the way, Juan sends a link to AXA Climate school. Today's bonus for participants is to use for free, to test for free AXA Climate school. So personally, I passed through it, and it's really interesting, and one understands much better actually what to do, not only in business but also in individual life, to decrease greenhouse gas emissions. And to start monitoring actually this activity. Yeah, please, Juan.
No, we are happy to hear your feedback, because the purpose of the climate school is not only to have an impact on corporate companies, but to have an impact on the individuals as well. So if you did have some consequences and some change in your daily life compared to other, let's say, behaviors that you could adopt, that is a very positive feedback for us. So thank you for that, for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. As for individual life, by the way, my last trip to Prague, 700 kilometers from Warsaw, was by train. So it's much less emissions by train comparing to airplane, for example,
sure.
So
I know if the audience is maybe too shy to ask questions, but what we could say, Lucile, is that we have a lot of various situations where we can you have work also not only on risk assessment topics, but also on with some corporate customers to support, let's say, climate awareness and onboarding of corporate companies. We are doing, let's say, very broad and very varied scope of works, and it can start also on, let's say, initial onboarding and awareness to ExCom members of an agri and food company as well, and not only risk assessment.
Yes, absolutely. And what's basically when we start to presenting and on board on this topic, what's quickly come to the observance when we're talking about agri is the necessity of local analysis, because when we are, as George mentioned, there's a risk of adaptations, and the transition is risky. But to de-risk it, to have a precise understanding of the local situation, the pedoclimatic context, is key to trigger this adaptation properly, basically.
And last, and that would be last. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, just to recap in simple words for clients and for GrECo colleagues, do understand correctly that this service is what we call climate adaptation services. At the end of the day, the client gets practical advice, what they need to do in, for example, agricultural practices or in food supply practices, if it comes to food processor, for example, or seed producer. So what they need to do to mitigate the negative consequences of climate risks, or what they need to do to use opportunities, because as I've heard in Northern Europe, we are waiting for some opportunities caused by climate change. So do I understand correctly that at the end of the day, the client gets some practical advice what to do, and of course the client understands better future cash flow, or can project better. Yeah, exactly.
It's local truths, local situations, so adapted to one farming system adaptation plan with figures on, okay, what's your risk if you don't do nothing? What's your risk or cost of adaptation, and where you'll land in terms of yields? We have an interesting question about the grapes correlation between sunny days and sugar content. Good experience there, and can you support proposal to customers? Yes, we have models to project the sugar or the GrECs, called GrECs, so sugar rates in grapes collected to heat and radiation. Yes, that we've built for wineries projection in California, Hungary, France. So that's something, exactly the kind of indicators that will have and will make the difference between, I don't know, in California for Merlot, one varieties of wine, how they will behave with heat compared to another wine varieties in Hungary. That's exactly the kind of indicators that we project, and project the quantity of sugar between two varieties in the future. So that's a great question and exactly on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the answer. So actually, I would like to add. So recently, I did my personal research. Analysis between financial indicators of sugar plants and weather factors like a number of hot days of soil moisture deficit, and actually. There is some kind of correlation between weather factor and sugar production. Also exist. So.
There's a quick question on tariff. Hard to give you an answer. Depends on the location, numbers of varieties. But happy to discuss this after via email. You have our contact at the end of the presentation.
Okay. Do you have any questions, comments?
Okay, then of course we'll be able to catch up other questions that will be raised further. We're not running too late, Maxime, on the schedule, so we can move on our section related to industrial assets, and then leave you the floor for the last section on parametric products. Just before going on the industrial assets, I would like to to stress that many industrial customers, I can include a global tire manufacturer, which is a customer of ours, which is impacted very strongly on agriculture supply chain, because as you may know, tires for cars and for planes, or all type of tires, are made also from a natural raw material, which is natural rubber, and those are not grown in manufacturing factories, but in real, let's say, agricultural plantations in very specific regions like Southeast Asia, Latin America, or Central Africa, and those regions are very impacted by climate change. So you don't need to be an agri and food company to be also impacted by the supply chain of natural raw materials. You can be like this car manufacturer, very directly impacted also by some key raw materials, which are natural resources and not, let's say, artificial or mineral raw materials. So that's that I wanted to stress this. Now on the last section, we'd like to, from our side, we'd like to stress the importance to adapt industrial assets as well. When we talk about all that, you have two types of risk. You have the acute climate risk, which are very known by insurers, like cyclones, floods, but you have also chronic climate risk, which are less, let's say, assessed by corporate companies. So that's why we will focus on the impact of physical climate risk, both chronic and acute climate risk. This is an example of a very, let's say, a standard list of climate indicators that we look at, which are, let's say, compliant to European taxonomy. And this is just some highlights of the indicators that we can set for those assessments. You have to know that we have more than 100 available climate indicators on the shelf to assess the impact of climate change on physical on industrial assets. Sorry. Just a very brief reminder on the definition of what a risk is. Many of you are professional in risk management and in insurance. But still, I want to stress that it's a combination of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Therefore, we have adopted this, let's say, definition to our methodology at AXA Climate. We have a very extensive modeling to have global data in a very fine and granular, with very high resolution at a global level. We have internal scientists, climatologists who have worked on the downsizing of global climate models on a very fine resolution for both parametric and consulting, as I said earlier. And thanks to this data, we can have a very, let's say, accurate exposure assessment. Then we will take into account the type of assets, and then we can compute, thanks to our insurance DNA, with a database of impact curve, the impact and the vulnerability of a given climate indicator on a specific type of asset. Therefore, what we do is, in a global approach, we'll look at historical events, even if this is not mandatory, because that can give you some weak signals of what can recur again in the future, but with higher intensity or higher frequency. Of course, the core mission of our consulting, let's say, practice is to assess the impact of climate change with the future climate scenarios, and based on the IPCC global modeling to have a science-based approach. Then the outcome of our missions is to help our customers to identify industrial assets which are most at risk, which one are most frequent let's say, exposed to a specific hazard, which one are exposed to most intense hazards. Of course, the most intense and the most frequent ones are the most at risk and the most, let's say, the priority list for you to assess an adaptation plan for those assets. I will give an example of an agrochemical company. Well, we have dozens of references, but for this one, it was quite interesting because, in fact, this is a real outcome of our story of this mission, is that it's not an operational and industrial asset that was most impacted. We identify a very specific vulnerability of its footprint in North America, where all his global operational data center was located in a very at-risk location, both to extreme heat and also in a very high flood risk area. And this is something that is very, let's say, surprising for the customer, because he thought that we would look only at the operational and industrial assets. And in fact, his weakness was coming from IT data center, because if this data center was down, most of its American operations would have been severely impacted in terms of business continuity. So this is the kind of findings that we could have. Of course, there were some other operational and industrial assets which were very at risk, especially on flood. Very severe impact in some locations because it's an agrochemical business. There are some chemical, let's say, reaction which are very sensitive to hot days and to very extreme heat, and therefore some cooling equipment were not operational with the heat wave that will be increasing in some specific areas, especially in America and in Southeast Asia. Now, just to give you a brief idea in the next couple of slides of what an adaptation plan is. With the definition of risk that I mentioned earlier, we start with the hazard, of course, definition, which is given by the European taxonomy or CSRD. Then we assess the vulnerability. As I said, this is a very important stage where you need to be as specific as possible to your company, and with very various impact from the different climate hazard. And then you set up a specific adaptation plan, because what we know is that a generic adaptation plan will not work, will not be operational, and cannot be implemented if it is not specific to your local operations and specific to your business processes, business and industrial processes. My last message is that in terms of climate adaptation, you have several, let's say, level of adaptation possibilities. You can protect, you can accommodate, you can live with this risk, you can retreat and flee, run away, like in other circumstances, or you can also choose to adapt. A concrete example of that is, of course, when you are speaking about retreat, you can move your location. What is interesting is that some corporate customer will consider a temporary retreat, which means a backup alternative production location, so that within a few days they can transfer production to another location in another region, which has not been impacted by an extreme event. So it can be a temporary retreat. Of course, you can also protect. You can build dikes, you can build levees, which can protect you. But in fact, this is a false protection, let's say, because in the longer term, dikes and levees can also be less maintained and vulnerable to flood, because they are aging and maintenance was not done well by your local teams or by local authorities. For instance, for budget reason, that can happen in France also and other countries. What we want to stress is that the most important part is you should think about a long-term adaptation. That's why it is difficult for companies to adopt a different mindset of adaptation, because they are focused on budget, they are focused on the next year, they are focused on very short-term priorities, sometimes on a quarterly basis, and therefore they need to change the way they look at the future, not only on the very short term, but on the longer term, because you should adapt also your industrial processes to new climate change, to new climate conditions. As I explained with agrochemical business, that can be a significant impact on the industrial processes and the way they design the new plants. Of course, you can also choose to adapt, to accommodate, because you can also accept to live with maybe 10 centimeters of flood on the shop floor. In some countries, like in India, for example, you cannot fully protect a location against monsoon and heavy rainfall. You have to accommodate with some local flooding sometimes, and with drainage system, sewage systems which are adapted, you can also accommodate with some residual risk on a location. So we wanted to do that fast so that we can have more time for Q&A and leave the floor also for the last section by Maxime on parametric. So if you have any questions before leaving the floor to Maxime.
Thank you, Juan, for your presentation. So, if to recap, as I understand, the outcome of your industry adaptation services is to show to the client what are vulnerable parts of industrial assets, where, for example, hot weather can cause. For example, the client has sprinklers, but they can trigger in case of hotter days. Yeah, or for example, the client have ventilation on pig farms, but it will not be enough for the future in 5 years, for example, and they need to understand in advance upfront what to do to protect or to sell this business at all. It means to avoid.
For sure. I can give you 2 examples. Thank you for this example of sprinkler, Maxime, because this is a discussion that we had recently. The sprinkler system was vulnerable to very extreme heat because it reached a temperature of 70 degrees Celsius below the metallic roof of an industrial factory. And therefore it triggered without any fire. So that was a very strong vulnerability to extreme heat, because during extreme heat waves, you're very vulnerable to local fires. And if your sprinkler system is out of service, it is quite a big problem. Also, we had an example with in tourism, as Georg said, the connection between physical risk and also transition risk, because with the climate change, our tourism customer was very severely impacted by natural snow coverage, which is decreasing very much. So if you have a chalet, a mountain house in the Alps area, for example, maybe you could consider to sell it, because it will lose a lot of value in the near future, by 2030, let's say. But seriously speaking, what is very important to consider, and the outcome of our missions with industrial assets, is that they realize that there's not only acute climate risk, but also impact from chronic climate risk, especially water stress. If you some industrial processes which are consuming a lot of water locally, water will not be an infinite resource in the coming future, or already today. We have faced a severe drought in France last summer. We will face severe drought again this summer. You had that in Eastern Europe already. Last, in Asia, there is lasting extreme drought in Taiwan, which will challenge semiconductor supply chain again this summer. while the last 2 years were very severely impacted by COVID. But drought will continue to impact the supply chain of semiconductors from Taiwan. And this is the kind of domino effect from climate change, not only on your assets, but on your whole value chain. This is why the European regulation emphasized the fact that when you look at climate change, you have to look at the value chain, including your suppliers and especially the agri-food business, which is the frontline, business impacted by climate change.
Thank you, Juan, for your comments. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. And let me go to the next presentation, which is done by me. Okay, so before this presentation, we are talking actually about the stages of risk management process. We're talking about risk identification, risk anticipation, risk quantification. So what consequences could be of the risk, and of course about risk mitigation in terms of climate adaptation of industrial assets and agricultural operations. Now we are talking about actually risk transfer. So before this, for those who are external participants, briefly about GrECo. So we are a family-owned company operating almost 100 years in Central and Eastern Europe, in 17 countries, more than 1,200 employees, and also presence in 200 countries of the world, thanks to our network of partners. So we are risk consultant and insurance specialist. And so I personally am in insurance industry for the last 22 years. And what I realize that before doing any insurance, we need first of all understand the risk and understand risk together with the client. And if it comes to climate change risks, so on this slide you can see actually what already colleagues mentioned, that climate change, especially drought and heat stress, which is considered by FAO as the most dangerous risk for food and agriculture industry. So they have impact for the whole supply chain. So we're talking about farmers, of course. Farmers, they suffer from this risk first of all, but also seed chemical producers and suppliers and food processors, because of scarcity of raw materials for food processing. Farmers don't grow too much and don't deliver enough. And all farmers don't buy chemicals or fertilizers or seeds because it's too dry and they cannot seed, for example. And also, if it comes to storage facilities, you can see on the slide that increasing temperature lead to actually risks of poisoning, food poisoning, and risks of additional electricity consumption to cool food in refrigerators. So if to talk about risk transfer, so this is a classical matrix of risk management where you can see that risk transfer is relevant when it comes to big loss, and the likelihood is relatively low, which makes risk transfer still affordable by food and agricultural company. And risk transfer works when we see that loss mitigation measures like climate adaptation is not enough. Yeah, it still can be loss, and loss can exceed risk appetite or risk tolerance of a food or agricultural company. If it comes about risk transfer, So in most cases, we can talk about insurance, because insurance is one of the most effective and risk transfer tool. Of course, weather risks can be insured via standard property damage business interruption policy. Most of agricultural or food processing clients, they have standard property damage policy business interruption. But for example, temperatures not covered. This is standard exception in property damage business interruption policy. It's a very interesting question. Water damage caused by sprinklers actually is covered in standard coverage. But what will happen? What will be reaction of insurance company if sprinklers trigger because of very, very hot weather, which is not covered by property damage and business interruption policy. And secondly, we need to have loss on premises of the policyholder or of the insured. For example, I remember the case in my practice in Latvia when it was too rainy. Our client didn't have, so actually the production area was inundated by water, but the client didn't have direct property loss, but his suppliers cannot deliver timber for wood processing because forest got into swamps. So they cannot get timber. So this is actually a non-damage business interruption, which is not covered by property damage business interruption policy. If it comes to mostly for farming segment, here we're talking about standard multi-peril crop insurance, which can cover drought or even heat stress, heat wave. But usually only farmers can buy it. For example, food processor who is dependent on farming suppliers cannot be the policyholder to insure crops of their suppliers. There's also a special type of insurance, we call it trade disruption insurance. Usually it comes to cargo transit cases when the policyholder, cargo owner, can be additionally protected when something happens during the way of cargo transit. For example, additional coverage can be added when, for example, the vessel is broken on the port, or where, for example, there is too dry, and if the cargo transit done via river, and the rivers the level of water is too low, so the cargo can be delivered, and there is business interruption caused by the problem in the logistics system. And of course, that Juan mentioned, we can use parametric insurance solution when we insure independent statistical yield parameter, or where we insure some weather factor like quantity of rain or temperatures or soil moisture. So in such a case, policyholder can be not only the farmer, but also seed or chemical producer, dealer, or food processor. For example, sugar plant. Of course, weather derivatives can be alternative forms. So the first weather derivative was issued in 1997 in Chicago Stock Exchange, as I remember, on regulated stock exchange market. But if it comes to regulated stock exchange markets, such weather derivatives are very standardized. They are not customized. There is also so-called OTC derivative market, or over-the-counter derivatives, provided also by insurance companies, by special entities of insurance groups, which can be much more customized for individual customers. For example, weather derivative to cover mild winter, for mild December, for example, for berry producer, or any other weather derivative. But from my point of view, the problem with weather derivatives is a taxation problem, because usually, as a rule, indemnity paid by weather derivatives goes into income tax. Probably for customers who get accustomed to buy insurance, this is not a standard solution, let's say, and the market not so regulated as insurance market. And of course, we can talk about alternative post-loss recovery. Very standard, let's say, banal standard way. When farmers are not insured, they go and ask some ad hoc support from the government. But such a way is getting more and more questionable, because now you know that it's very difficult to print money again for the government to give to the farmers in case of catastrophic event. Of course, this support from the government is not predictable, and other players in food supply chain actually are not protected, so they cannot go and ask money from the government, in case of catastrophic weather event. Still, such financial recovery, like a trade loan, is practiced by farmers who actually, in order to seed again after hot, dry summer, they ask for trade loan from dealers or from producers of seeds, chemicals, fertilizers. But again, now you know the interest rate is growing. This loan is getting more and more expensive, and again, not predictable comparing to insurance policy. And as I mentioned, drought and heat stress are the major problem now for food and agriculture. And this is actually the chart from FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of United Nations, where you can see that the losses caused by drought, the share of agriculture in losses caused by drought is 83%, comparing to other perils. If it comes to drought insurance provided by local insurance market in Central and Eastern Europe, so there are some systematic problems. Actually, it's very difficult to insure drought in standard way in local markets because traditionally crop insurance is more hail insurance. Insurance companies, the local insurance companies, national insurance companies don't have too much risk appetite to cover the drought and heat stress. And they also have some technical problem to do loss adjustment, to do risk assessment. And they suffer also from highly volatile and not sustainable insurance portfolio. Of course, there are ways to improve the access of farmers and other stakeholders in food supply chain to drought coverage, but it requires a really quite sustainable public-private partnership when government, farmers, and insurance market cooperate together. And it should be very strong participation of the government in insurance schemes in order to increase penetration of insurance of drought insurance in the market. And based on this situation, actually parametric insurance plays a quite important role, because parametric insurance can be offered by international insurance and insurance markets for European Union customers. If it comes to outside European Union, it can be the policy can be issued in the domicile country and further reinsured to the final risk taker. So this type of insurance can be offered and can be quite well customized. And now I will show you several examples what can be insured, what can be transferred in such a way. So here you can see example of corn yields in one of the region of Romania, and you can see actually that from 2001 to 2021 yields are growing. So we see positive trend. because of improvement of agricultural technology. But you can see good years when farmer harvest a lot, and you can see big yield shortfall. Yeah, and in 2022 in Romania, actually it was again too dry, and actually the loss was even higher comparing to 2020. So actually almost 2 droughts in a row. So actually the frequency of negative events is growing. So what we can ensure? We can ensure actually situation when yield statistic will drop below the certain level. For example, we drop below 4 tons, for example, for corn in this specific region. And food processor can be the policy holder to get indemnity to compensate the losses caused by non-delivery of enough raw materials, or seed producer can be covered by such solution. So this is a soil moisture index example. So when we ensure situation when soil moisture level is above the certain level, for example, in 2020, you can see that it was by 33% drier than usually for last 20 years. So, and this is ensured event area where food processor, farmer, or seed or chemical producer, dealer can be covered against drought. And the data can be collected from satellites in case of soil moisture index. The soil moisture index is much better than, for example, rainfall index, because soil moisture actually this is the result of combination of several weather factors like rainfall, temperature, wind speed, density of plants. And correlation between soil moisture deficit and final yield is very high. So that's why these models, from our point of view, is the most reliable models. And the data can be get from special cells. So you can see fields of the client, and we understand from which cells and which coordinate of the grids we need to use to get the soil moisture data. To have this historical average soil moisture line, and here you can see in 2020 soil moisture deficit, which is below this historical soil moisture line. And we can use with with higher resolution data, 1 to 1 kilometer, and if we have access to the fields, so we can get the data for each field for last, for example, 15 years. And we know what actually happened for last 15 years on each field in terms of soil moisture. And again, we can build up the relevant model with higher resolution. This example of heat stress cover, for example, for corn. Corn usually pollinating at the end of June and the beginning of July. And this example from Slovakia, you can see 2012 was very unusual. The same situation was in Romania, Ukraine, 2017. So we can cover, for example, situation or scenario of 2012-2017, when the number of hot days with temperature above 30 degrees will be higher, for example, than 8. And in such a case, the client will get instant indemnity without any paperwork, just signing 2 papers. Predicted yield index, this is new trend what we see when there are special models. Here you can see the model from Pham, aquacrop model. The yield can be predicted using many factors, using machine learning algorithms. There are advantages and disadvantages of these solutions, but these solutions can be additionally supplemented to other weather index models or to yield index in order to improve the solution for the client. NDVI index, when we use satellite data images of green vegetation mass, can be used to evaluate historically the bad NDVI in specific years. So we know, for example, location of all arable lands in Romania. Thanks again to satellite data, we know the special service from Copernicus where we can identify field crops. And we can calculate, for example, in Romania, historically, what percentage of area in Romania was damaged, for example, by autumn drought. This is very interesting solution to ensure bad germination, for example, of rapeseed. which is getting a very big problem in Southern Europe because of dry weather and hot weather in August, September, October. So if to recap, so catastrophic risks, especially drought and heat stress, impact on financial resilience in the food supply chain, including agricultural input producers and food processors, not only farmers. Losses caused by drought, heat stress risk cannot be fully mitigated. Insurance is relevant when expected losses or potential maximum loss combined with implemented climate adaptation measures still exceed retention level risk tolerance of a company in the food supply chain. So it still can happen, high loss can happen. And insurance is effective mechanism, much more effective than alternative forms like self-retention, loan, or ad hoc aid by the government. So this is what I want to share with you today. I'm okay to answer to your questions. What is the situation now with satellite monitoring for Ukraine territory? So about satellite data for Ukraine at the moment, we recommend using ERA5 data sets because it's much more recognized by reinsurance markets and international insurance markets comparing to AXA Sentinel data, because we have a lot of gaps at the moment if to look at the territory of Ukraine, if to use AXA Sentinel data. So from my point of view, ERA5 land 9 to 9 kilometers is still okay to use to cover drought risks, because if it comes to catastrophic drought year, the resolution 9 to 9 kilometers still okay to identify the drought. So there is the basis risk is very low in such a case. The basis risk means that physical situation on fields doesn't correspond with the index what we get from satellite data. But drought usually covers vast territories of the country. That's why 9 to 9 kilometers can be used. And this data set is very reliable and quite stable for many years. And we have historical data set of for last 50 years. It's very good also for pricing drought risk in insurance. Okay. Thank you, audience, for your attention and that you stayed with us to the end. If you have any further questions or you need some clarification in respect of industrial or agricultural climate adaptation, in respect of implementation corporate sustainability reporting standards, or in respect how to transfer climate risk to insurance company or another risk taker, please don't hesitate to contact colleagues from GrECo in your countries, or to contact me, and we can organize individual meetings, individual negotiations to clarify your needs and to help you in your business. So thank you, Juan, Lucile, and Georg for your today participation, and I wish you good continuation of today, and good luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Georg, for this partnership with you. Really looking forward to doing business and a lot of business together in Central Eastern Europe. Thank you for this invitation today.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you, Lucile.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Merci, Lucile. Bye-bye.